Chapter 1. From Bedouin Roots to Revolutionary. Under the endless sky of the Libyan desert, where the sun blazes by day and the stars crowd the night like diamonds scattered across black velvet, a boy was born in 1942 who would one day seize the imagination of nations and drive world leaders to fits of frustration. His name was Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi. Though most of the world would simply know him as Gaddafi, a man who somehow managed to be a desert mystic, a revolutionary, a statesman, a trickster, and, occasionally, a headache wrapped in sunglasses. His beginning was not glamorous. No golden crib, no marble halls, no air-conditioned nursery. Gaddafi was born in a Bedouin tent near Sirte, a coastal town on the Mediterranean, into a family of herders. His father tended camels, goats, and sheep, and his mother kept the family alive with grit, determination, and an ability to stretch almost nothing into something. Poverty was not a concept to young Gaddafi, it was daily reality. Shoes were a luxury, schoolbooks had to be begged for, borrowed, or scribbled together by hand. If you wanted water, you dug. If you wanted shade, you prayed for clouds. But there is something about the desert that raises dreamers. Maybe it's the silence, broken only by the wind. Maybe it's the vastness that makes small boys think of big futures. Or maybe it's the fact that when you grow up with almost nothing, you see everything as possible. Little Muammar wasn't just ambitious, he was stubborn. Teachers in his early Quranic school said he would argue over scripture, not out of disrespect but because he wanted to improve the meaning. He was a boy who believed even God's word might benefit from editing, an early sign of the eccentric ruler he would later become. Libya at the time was not a happy place. It had just shaken off Italian colonial rule, and then endured British and French occupation after World War II. King Idris, a quiet, aging monarch propped up by the West, ruled with more concern for foreign oil contracts than his people's hunger. The country was poor, backward, and divided by tribes. Imagine a desert kingdom where oil lay hidden under the sands like a genie in a bottle, but the people were barefoot while foreigners polished their boots with Libyan wealth. To a boy like Gaddafi, this was an insult. By his teenage years, he was devouring radio broadcasts about Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, the fiery Arab nationalist who promised to kick out imperialists and unite Arabs under one proud banner. To Gaddafi, Nasser wasn't just a leader. He was a rock star of revolution. Posters of Nasser were hidden under Muammar's schoolbooks, and when other boys dreamed of football or marriage, he dreamed of overthrowing kings and waving flags of unity. Still, Gaddafi was also just a kid, mischievous, charming, sometimes a bit too dramatic. Friends remembered him organizing mock parades in the schoolyard, forcing classmates to march in circles while he barked orders like a miniature general. He wrote amateur plays where the villain was always some caricature of a greedy Westerner, and the hero, surprise, surprise, looked suspiciously like Muammar himself. If self-confidence were a currency, young Gaddafi was already richer than Libya's oil fields. His chance to rise came through education. The monarchy, for all its faults, did establish a few schools, and Muammar excelled enough to win a place at Siba, a secondary school in the south. There, he formed a small underground group of students who swore to overthrow King Idris. They weren't armed with much more than notebooks and teenage bravado, but the seed was planted. The desert boy wanted power, not for riches, at least not yet, but to end what he saw as humiliation. Of course, every revolutionary needs a stage, and for Muammar, that stage became the military. In 1963, at the age of 21, he entered the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi. The irony was delicious, the future destroyer of monarchy being trained in a king's own school. But Gaddafi didn't care. He learned tactics, studied strategy, and built a network of like-minded officers, young men disillusioned by Idris's weakness and eager for change. They called themselves the Free Officers Unionists, borrowing Nasser's playbook from Egypt. To outsiders, they looked like an ordinary batch of cadets. To themselves, they were a ticking bomb. It's worth pausing here to note something important about Gaddafi's personality. He wasn't a cold ideologue. He was theatrical. He loved symbols, grand gestures, and a touch of drama. When other cadets studied logistics, Muammar was scribbling manifestos in the margins of his notebooks. When others practiced drills, he plotted how to broadcast his first speech after seizing power. He was equal parts soldier and playwright, which made him magnetic and dangerous. The Libya he planned to inherit was, by the mid-1960s, a paradox. Beneath its sand lay some of the richest oil reserves in Africa, but ordinary Libyans lived in mud huts or tents. Foreign companies, Exxon, Mobil, BP, Eni, were shipping billions in profits overseas, while children in Sirte and Sava studied by candlelight. The monarchy relied heavily on foreign advisors and military bases, particularly the Americans and the British. Wheelus Air Base near Tripoli was one of the largest U.S. facilities outside America itself, complete with swimming pools, bowling alleys, and drive-in cinemas for U.S. servicemen. Meanwhile, Libyan kids like Muammar had to walk miles barefoot to fetch water. For Gaddafi, this wasn't just unfair. It was infuriating. He often told friends that the king was nothing more than a puppet of the West, dangling on strings of oil contracts. And if the king was a puppet, then Muammar believed he was destined to be the puppeteer who cut the strings. By 1966, Gaddafi and a handful of conspirators were quietly recruiting allies in the military. They studied Egypt's 1952 coup, which toppled King Farouk, and they rehearsed in whispers how to seize radio stations, barracks, and airports. They didn't have money, they didn't have tanks, but they had something just as powerful: conviction. And conviction, when paired with timing, can topple thrones. Still, there's an irony here that history shouldn't miss. Gaddafi despised the West, but his entire military education was Western-inspired. He later trained in the United Kingdom, attending a course at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst's affiliated program. He visited English pubs, struggled with the language, and reportedly found the rain unbearable. But he also learned discipline, strategy, and the value of precision. When he returned to Libya, he was more convinced than ever that Libya deserved better than a tired king and foreign boots. In the evenings, Gaddafi would sit under the desert stars, scribbling in notebooks. He wrote about freedom, Arab unity, Islam as a guiding principle, and the dignity of the Bedouin life. Some of it was poetic, some of it rambling, and some of it just plain odd, but it was the mind of a young man convinced he was chosen for destiny. By 1969, he was ready. And Libya, though it didn't know it, was about to change forever. In the final years of the 1960s, while most of the world was grooving to the Beatles or watching men walk on the moon, Libya was quietly sliding toward a storm. Few outsiders noticed. To the average American or Brit, Libya was little more than an oil well with sand dunes attached. To most Arabs, it was a quiet kingdom ruled by an aging monarch, King Idris, who seemed more interested in religious retreats than running his country. But to a small circle of young officers, including a certain Muammar Gaddafi, Libya was a land waiting for rebirth. King Idris had his strengths. He was pious, respected by some tribes, and had helped guide Libya to independence in 1951. But by the late 60s, he was elderly, sick, and completely out of touch. He spent much of his time abroad for medical treatment, leaving behind ministers who were either corrupt, lazy, or both. The economy was lopsided. Oil revenues were flowing in, but little of it trickled down to the ordinary shepherds and laborers. The country's tribal divisions, East versus West, desert versus coast, were barely held together with the royal glue of Idris's Senussi clan. This was the backdrop against which Gaddafi sharpened his ambitions. To him, Idris wasn't just weak, he was a relic. The king symbolized the old order of colonial compromise, bowing to Western interests while ordinary Libyans remained shackled by poverty. If history was a stage, Idris was dozing in the wings, while Gaddafi was waiting for the curtain to rise. The group of conspirators around him was small but committed. They called themselves the Free Officers Movement, deliberately echoing the Egyptian officers who had toppled King Farouk in 1952. They were captains and lieutenants, not generals. And that was their advantage. They were too junior to be suspected. The higher ranks, fat with privilege and loyalty to Idris, didn't take them seriously. But these young men were quietly meeting in safe houses, scribbling maps of barracks and airfields, and whispering plans into the humid Benghazi night. In 1969, fate handed them a golden opportunity. King Idris planned a trip abroad for medical care, leaving the country in the hands of his unpopular crown prince. It was like leaving a house with the doors unlocked and the windows open. Gaddafi and his circle decided the time had come. On the night of September 1, 1969, a convoy of young officers moved quietly through Tripoli and Benghazi. There were no tanks rumbling dramatically through the streets, no great firefights. It was not the stuff of Hollywood, it was more like a military dorm prank that somehow succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Soldiers took over radio stations, airports, and government offices with almost laughable ease. By dawn, Libya had changed governments. The monarchy was finished. The announcement came over the radio. A new revolutionary command council had seized power in the name of the people. The voice that read the proclamation was calm, authoritative, and young. Most Libyans had never heard of this Muammar Gaddafi before, but they would hear plenty from him in the decades to come. Here was the twist: many Libyans didn't resist. In fact, some cheered. The monarchy had brought stability but little progress. The oil wealth was still being siphoned abroad. So when these fresh-faced officers promised justice, equality, and Arab pride, the public, weary of Idris's lethargy, was willing to give them a chance. And Gaddafi, at just 27 years old, was now in charge. Think about that for a moment. A man barely out of his 20s, with no deep political experience, suddenly running a nation sitting on billions of barrels of oil. Most young men his age were still figuring out how to pay rent. Gaddafi was figuring out how to re-engineer a country. In those early days, optimism was genuine. The Revolutionary Command Council shut down foreign military bases, slashed rents, redistributed land, and raised salaries. Schools and hospitals suddenly had funding. Illiteracy programs were launched and health care, at least on paper, became free. Western oil companies were forced into renegotiations, with a much larger share of revenues staying in Libya. To the average Libyan who had grown up under colonial shadow and royal neglect, it felt like a new dawn. But the dawn came with shadows. While Gaddafi spoke the language of liberation, he also moved swiftly to consolidate power. Political parties were banned. Dissenting voices were silenced. The Revolutionary Council was theoretically collective, but in practice, Gaddafi's charisma and stubborn will dominated. He was young, idealistic, yes, but also utterly convinced that his vision was superior to anyone else's. That combination would become both his strength and his curse. It's important, though, not to paint Gaddafi here as a cartoon villain twirling his mustache. At this stage, he wasn't bloodthirsty. He wasn't paranoid, not yet. He was genuinely driven by the dream of Arab unity, of dignity for the poor, of reclaiming Libya's wealth from outsiders. He looked around at the barefoot children in Sirte and the shiny American jeeps rolling out of Wheelus Air Base and thought, this cannot continue. And so, the boy from the tent had become the man of the moment. He was scrappy, he was bold, and, at least for now, he was popular. Western diplomats scrambled to update their files. Washington and London didn't know what to make of this young colonel who quoted the Quran one moment and Nasser the next. Some thought he was naive. Others feared he might be dangerous. None of them, in 1969, realized just how unpredictable and enduring Gaddafi's rule would be. For now, though, the story was still romantic. A poor shepherd's son, armed with nothing more than conviction and a handful of comrades, had toppled a monarchy without a single battle. Libya was free, or so it seemed. The desert had given birth to a dreamer, and the world was just beginning to hear his voice. The weeks after the coup were a whirlwind. One day, Muammar Gaddafi was a young officer in a crisp uniform, plotting in whispers. The next, he was seated in the presidential office with the weight of a nation balanced precariously on his shoulders. He didn't sit in some golden palace at first. The monarchy's luxury estates were there for the taking, but Gaddafi famously refused them. He preferred his tent, his Bedouin rugs, and his austere habits. To many Libyans, this was proof. Here was a leader who lived like the people, not above them. That image was crucial. Gaddafi knew symbolism mattered. The desert tent became more than just a personal preference. It became a statement. Whenever foreign leaders visited, instead of greeting them in a sterile government building, he would pitch his tent in the middle of Tripoli or even abroad. Imagine world leaders arriving with entourages and black cars, only to sit cross-legged on the carpet of a tent while sipping camel's milk. It was both charming and infuriating, a performance that said, "I am not like you, and I will not play by your rules." In those first years, he styled himself not as a president, but as a revolutionary leader. He held no official title higher than colonel, refusing to promote himself further. It was as if to say, "I am one of you, just a soldier." Of course, this was more theater than reality. He was no longer one of the people. He was the man in charge of the people. But the modesty act played well, and many Libyans, weary of Idris's detachment, adored the young colonel's swagger. Meanwhile, behind the tents and theatrics, Gaddafi was studying. He pored over books on socialism, Islam, tribal traditions, and Western philosophy. His mind was restless, always searching for the grand formula that could explain and fix society. Unlike many rulers who relied on advisors, Gaddafi fancied himself a thinker. Ideas scribbled in notebooks soon evolved into grand speeches, and those speeches hinted at a larger vision. This was the beginning of what would one day become his infamous Green Book. But before we get to the ideology, let's not skip the quirks, because Gaddafi was nothing if not quirky. For one thing, he adored fashion. While most world leaders stuck to drab suits, Gaddafi appeared in flowing robes, glittering uniforms, or Bedouin cloaks that looked more fit for a costume drama than a cabinet meeting. He wasn't just leading Libya, he was starring in his own revolutionary saga. And then there were the female bodyguards. Yes, the rumors are true. Gaddafi surrounded himself with a squad of hand-picked women, trained as elite protectors, dressed in khaki, sunglasses perched on their noses, pistols at their hips. It was another symbol, a rejection of conservative norms, a message that women could be powerful in his Libya. Cynics said it was just vanity and theatrics. Supporters said it was revolutionary feminism. Either way, it made him unforgettable. Despite the eccentricities, his popularity at home in the early years was genuine. Oil revenues skyrocketed after he renegotiated contracts, and he funneled much of that money into infrastructure. Roads were paved, schools built, hospitals expanded. Illiteracy rates dropped sharply. For the first time, many Libyans felt like they were sharing in their nation's wealth. Gaddafi called it justice. The West called it resource nationalism. But for a boy from a tent who had grown up watching foreigners profit while Libyans stayed barefoot, it was vindication. Of course, the West wasn't pleased. American and British diplomats bristled as their military bases were closed. Oil executives ground their teeth as profit margins shrank. Yet Gaddafi wasn't completely hostile, not yet. He still spoke of partnership, though always on Libya's terms. "We do not want your charity," he declared in one speech, "we want our dignity." That line, delivered with Bedouin fire, played beautifully in Tripoli but set off alarm bells in Washington. At the same time, Gaddafi's gaze stretched far beyond Libya. He was captivated by Nasser's dream of Arab unity. In his mind, Libya was not an isolated state but part of a grand Arab nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Gulf. He pushed for unions with Egypt, Sudan, and Syria, though most of these political marriages collapsed as quickly as they were proposed. Still, the ambition was clear. Gaddafi didn't just want to run Libya, he wanted to be a pillar of Arab destiny. This was where idealism began to blur into hubris. On the one hand, he had every reason to dream big. Oil revenues had given Libya immense leverage. He was young, popular, and unencumbered by old elites. On the other hand, the Arab world was notoriously divided. Tribal rivalries, sectarian tensions, and political egos made unity almost impossible. But Gaddafi refused to see it. He believed sheer willpower could bend reality, and he, Muammar of Gaddafi, had plenty of willpower to spare. Libya itself was changing rapidly under his watch. The monarchy's relics, statues, symbols, and titles were swept away. Ministries were reorganized. Revolutionary committees sprang up to monitor workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods. On the surface, it was about empowering ordinary people. In practice, it meant tightening the state's grip. If you wanted to praise Gaddafi, the microphone was open. If you wanted to criticize him, best to keep your mouth shut. Yet in those early years, repression was relatively mild compared to what would come later. There were arrests, yes, and opponents were sidelined. But there was also genuine enthusiasm. The colonel was still seen as a reformer, a man of the people. Ordinary Libyans were willing to overlook the cracks, because the foundation, jobs, schools, hospitals, was stronger than ever before. Still, even as he basked in the glow of revolution, Gaddafi carried the desert with him. He often spoke of the Bedouin life as the purest form of existence, free of corruption, simple, dignified. He claimed modern civilization was making people weak, greedy, disconnected from their roots. And so, in a way, he saw himself as a prophet calling his people back to something essential. Not just oil wealth, not just Arab unity, but a deeper identity rooted in sand and sky. That vision, part nostalgia, part philosophy, part performance, would shape the strange experiment of his later years. For now, though, it was enough to keep the people inspired and the West uneasy. The boy from the tent had not only toppled a king, he had redefined what leadership could look like. And whether the world loved him or hated him, one thing was certain: they could no longer ignore him. By the mid-1970s, the honeymoon was beginning to fray. Revolutions, after all, are exhilarating in the first rush of triumph, but they are exhausting to sustain. Gaddafi had kicked out the foreigners, nationalized oil, and built schools. The people cheered, but now they wanted stability, predictability, and something resembling normal governance. The trouble was, Gaddafi had no interest in normal. Normal, to him, meant stale parliaments, self-serving elites, and bureaucratic stagnation. He wanted something new, something uniquely Libyan. And so, he unveiled his grand experiment, the Jamahiriya, or state of the masses. It sounded brilliant on paper. Instead of parliaments, there would be people's congresses. Instead of a president, the masses themselves would govern directly. Decisions would rise from neighborhoods to towns to national councils. In theory, every Libyan had a voice. In practice, those voices echoed back whatever the revolutionary committees wanted to hear. Still, the packaging was seductive. Gaddafi had invented his own political system, a hybrid of socialism, Islam, and tribal traditions, wrapped neatly in his handwritten manifesto, the Green Book. The book itself was slim, 3 parts, written in Gaddafi's idiosyncratic style. Part philosophy, part rant, part utopian blueprint, it declared that true democracy meant abolishing representation entirely. Representation is fraud, he wrote. To say that a man represents another is impossible. It was, in a sense, a bold critique of Western systems. But it was also wildly impractical. After all, someone still had to run the state, balance the books, and keep the water flowing. And here lies the paradox of Gaddafi. He was both visionary and delusional. He genuinely believed the Jamahiriya could liberate humanity from oppression. But he also used it as a convenient cloak for one-man rule. He could claim, with a straight face, "I am not Libya's ruler, the people are," while simultaneously pulling every lever of power behind the curtain. It was Wizard of Oz politics, Bedouin edition. At first, many Libyans went along with it. Why not? Oil wealth was still trickling down. Homes were being distributed. Food and fuel were subsidized. For newlyweds, the state offered financial help. Education and healthcare remained free. In everyday life, these things mattered more than the nuances of political theory. If you were a farmer suddenly irrigating your land thanks to the great man-made river project, you probably weren't quibbling about the contradictions of direct democracy. But there were cracks. Tribal rivalries never fully disappeared, and some groups resented the centralization of power. Intellectuals who questioned the Green Book found themselves silenced. The revolutionary committees became feared enforcers, watching classrooms, offices, and mosques. Dissent wasn't tolerated, not in whispers, not in jokes, not in graffiti. Libya had been transformed from a monarchy of detachment into a republic of surveillance. Internationally, Gaddafi's star was rising, though not always in the way he intended. Arab leaders looked at the young colonel with mixed feelings. Some admired his bravado, others saw him as a reckless upstart. He pushed hard for Arab unity, proposing mergers and federations with Egypt, Tunisia, even Morocco. Each time, negotiations collapsed amid suspicion and ego clashes. The dream of a single Arab nation was slipping away, but Gaddafi's ambition only grew larger. If Arabs wouldn't unite, perhaps Africa would. Meanwhile, in Washington, London, and Paris, officials were losing patience. They saw Gaddafi as a loose cannon, a man with too much oil money and not enough restraint. His support for radical groups, his fiery speeches at the UN, his swaggering defiance of Western oil companies, all of it made him a target. The CIA and MI6 began to toy with opposition groups, whispering about coups, planning contingencies. Gaddafi, ever paranoid, sniffed out some of these plots and used them to justify even harsher crackdowns at home. And yet, amid the tension, the young colonel still held onto his desert romanticism. He continued pitching tents even on official state visits, infuriating protocol officers. He lectured foreign journalists about the purity of Bedouin life, the dangers of modern decadence, and the superiority of his direct democracy. Sometimes he sounded prophetic, other times eccentric, but always unforgettable. Back home, Libya was morphing into a land of contradictions. Its GDP per capita soared, making it one of Africa's richest states. Literacy climbed. Life expectancy stretched beyond 70 years. For many ordinary Libyans, life was objectively better than under the monarchy. But the price of that prosperity was silence. Speak against the colonel, and you risked vanishing into a prison cell or worse. Still, in the 1970s and early 1980s, hope outweighed fear. Gaddafi remained, for many, the charismatic son of the desert who had defied kings and superpowers. His eccentricities were seen as color, not madness. His Green Book was taught in schools, yes, but so were free science classes and medical training. The contradictions were tolerated because the oil kept flowing, the water kept coming, and the dream, however strange, was alive. In retrospect, this was Gaddafi's golden era. He was young, vigorous, untarnished by the disasters to come. He still believed he could bend history with sheer determination. And the world, whether they loved him or loathed him, believed he just might. It was also a dangerous time. Because when a man begins to see himself not merely as a leader but as a savior, when he confuses his own will with the destiny of nations, the stage is set for both triumph and tragedy. And so, as the desert winds whipped across Sirte and Tripoli, Muammar Gaddafi stood tall, not just as a colonel, not just as a revolutionary, but as a man who believed he could reshape the world itself. He had climbed from a Bedouin tent to the palace of kings, but in his heart he never left the desert. That heart, proud and restless, would propel him into dreams far larger than Libya's borders, dreams that would inspire millions, terrify the West, and ultimately lead to the undoing of both a man and a nation. The boy from the sands was now the colonel of a nation. But soon he would try to crown himself something even greater, the architect of Africa's future.